Hello, this is Dr. Clarence R. Pearson Sr., and welcome to My View, a podcast where I offer my professional perspective on today's most pressing geopolitical and socioeconomic issues. Recently, my attention has been drawn to developments in the Middle East, where the United States president has announced a Navy blockade of the Strait of Hormuz after failed peace negotiations with Iran, but even more importantly, an apparent waning of U.S. global influence. Here's my view on the matter. The fading horizon. America's power still matters, but its influence no longer commands obedience. The crisis now unfolding around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz reveals a hard truth about American power in 2026. The United States can still coerce, still deploy, and still disrupt, but it can no longer assume that its closest allies will automatically fall in line. The collapse of the Islamabad talks and Washington's subsequent decision to impose a blockade on traffic entering and leaving Iranian ports have not demonstrated renewed hegemony. They have exposed the limits of a superpower that increasingly acts alone and then discovers that acting alone is more expensive, more dangerous, and less effective than it once was. Reuters reported on April 13th that the US military would begin enforcing the blockade at 1400 GMT, while Iran threatened retaliation and oil prices surged back above $100 a barrel. This is the essence of waning influence. Influence is not the same thing as military capability. A state may still have the means to impose costs and move fleets, but its influence wanes when it cannot convert power into consent, burden sharing, or durable legitimacy. That is precisely what the current episode shows. President Trump could order the blockade. He could not persuade Britain to join it. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the United Kingdom would not back the US led blockade and instead would focus on reopening the strait and restoring lawful navigation. At the same time, Britain and France moved to co host talks on a strictly defensive maritime mission, explicitly separate from Washington's coercive approach. Europe's reaction has been equally telling. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described restoration of freedom of navigation in the strait as of paramount importance, but she did so in language that underscored the damage being caused by the closure and the wider instability in the region, not in support of the American blockade itself. This is a subtle but important distinction. Allies still recognize the strategic importance of the waterway. They simply no longer equate that recognition with endorsement of Washington's method. The strategic disconnect is not limited to Hormuz. It has been building across multiple theaters. Reuters reported on April 10th that Trump's Gaza Board of Peace had received less than $1 billion of the $17 billion pledged, with only the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco having actually contributed funds. The result is that the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the US backed technocratic body meant to enter the enclave, remains unable to move forward because, as one source put it, no money is currently available. That is not simply a funding problem, it is a confidence problem. Allies and partners are withholding not just cash, but political endorsement from a strategy they did not design and do not trust. The Greenland crisis earlier this year offered another signal. Reuters reported in January that Trump's threats to seize Greenland triggered a wave of European solidarity with Denmark and prompted efforts to bolster Arctic security. In the end, what emerged was not annexation or submission, but a climb down package as a framework for US access, with Danish and Greenlandic leaders insisting that any talks respect territorial integrity. A hegemon in full command does not force its allies to defend themselves against it. A hegemon in decline does exactly that. The economic consequences of this influence gap are immediate. Reuters reported that benchmark Brent crude surged more than 7% on April 13th, while physical crude in Europe traded near $150 a barrel as buyers scrambled for alternatives. Morgan Stanley projected that supply chains would take months to normalize, even if the strait reopened. The blockade is therefore not just a military measure, it is an inflationary instrument with global consequences. It raises shipping costs, feeds energy uncertainty, and intensifies policy volatility at a moment when allied coordination would matter most. The security dimension is equally stark. The United States is now carrying a burden that, in earlier eras, would likely have been shared more broadly. Reuters cited former Pentagon official Dana Stroul, warning that the blockade mission would be difficult to execute alone and likely unsustainable over the medium to long term. That observation cuts to the heart of the current predicament. American military power has not vanished, but because Allied political capital has thinned, the United States must bear more of the operational risk itself. That is what waning influence looks like in strategic terms, not impotence, but overexposure. The costs will not stop at the fuel pump. Reuters also reported on April 13th that a UN backed diplomatic push was underway to create a mechanism for safe fertilizer passage through Hormuz because shortages were already biting. The 6 week war and the near halt in shipping have threatened agricultural output far beyond the Middle East, with severe implications for Asia, Africa, and Latin America. A superpower that once claimed to underwrite the global commons is now presiding over a crisis in which food security itself depends on emergency workarounds assembled outside the US framework. For Americans, this influence gap becomes a domestic economic story very quickly. Higher oil prices mean higher transport costs, more expensive diesel, tighter farm margins, and more pressure on household budgets. Reuters reported that benchmark crude had moved back above $100, while the physical market showed even greater distress. This is how geopolitical isolation turns into bread and butter pain. The United States still possesses unmatched hard power, but if it cannot mobilize allies to stabilize markets or share the burden of intervention, its own consumers end up paying a larger share of the price. None of this means the United States is finished as a global power. It means the world has become less willing to treat American preferences as self executing. The route back from this fading horizon is not surrender, it is strategic humility. Washington would need to return to a form of multilateral realism, in which allies are treated as partners rather than as subordinates, in which diplomacy is not merely a pause before coercion, and in which leadership is measured by the ability to convene and shape outcomes rather than simply to impose them. The contrast is already visible. While Washington has turned to blockade, Oman has urged painful concessions. Britain has refused to join the US action, and Europe has moved toward its own defensive maritime consultations. The lesson of 2026 is therefore larger than Iran. True hegemony is not the ability to act without permission. It is the ability to lead in such a way that others still choose to follow. On that measure, the United States is not powerless, but it is plainly less persuasive than it once was. And if Washington continues to substitute unilateral pressure for coalition leadership, the fading horizon of American influence may soon become something more permanent. My View is a continuing series where I share informed commentary on a wide range of geopolitical and socioeconomic topics. If you found today's discussion helpful, please follow, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I invite you to explore other My View episodes available online. Until we meet again, goodbye.